But I represent a district in Southern California, which is prone to wildfires because of bad land management practices from Sacramento. And we have drought and the impact of climate change. And I share the concern of climate change and welcome the opportunities to work together without raising the cost for American firms, retirees, and punishing small businesses with onerous climate disclosure requirements. Nevertheless, the issue at hand here is that the existing SEC rules like 14A8 and the SEC Chair Gensler's decision to roll back the 2020 proxy advisory reforms has politicized boardrooms and directed firms to devote more time and resources on costly non-material proposals. So let me ask you, Mr. Copeland. According to NASDAQ, in fiscal year 2022, nearly 4 times more capital was raised in private offerings than in public markets. In your written testimony, you mentioned that we have seen the number of companies listed on the U.S. public exchanges decline more than 50% since the mid-1980s. So what do you attribute that decline to? Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of factors. I mean, one is, this body has acted in ways that increased the cost of being public through Sarbanes-Oxley in 2003. One is that we've had this more onerous sort of oversight for being a public company is a bit different today for the reasons that Larry Cunningham talked about in his opening statement. The landscape has shifted, and nowadays you're going to be called to task by these proxy advisory firms that didn't even exist back in the mid-'80s, or they were just beginning back in the mid-'80s, and they certainly didn't exist with the kind of power they had, let alone these big asset management fund families like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. They existed, but they didn't have nearly the market share and clout they have now. So you're going to have to answer to all these sorts of so there's a cost to doing business of being public. Yeah. And so what we're doing with a lot more private ownership than public ownership, we're creating a 2-tiered system of ownership so that some people, Americans that aren't wealthy, that aren't accredited investors, don't have access to all the same sort of market returns as others.
You know, over the 5 decades, we have transitioned our retirement system from defined benefit to defined contribution plans like 401k. And in 2019, private sector defined contribution, they had 85.5 million active participants. So in your view, how could the slowdown in IPO activity and costly non-material shareholder proposals impact the returns on retirement savings for Americans?
I mean, it unambiguously hurts it, particularly because a lot of these defined contribution plans aren't going to have access to private capital sources, depending on who your employer is. I mean, the move towards defined contributions is a great move. You don't want to be relying on your employer for your retirement too, because then if your employer goes belly up, you're in trouble, right? So this is a good thing in general, but yeah, not having as many companies in the public markets is a problem.
I want to throw out one question to you, Mr. Cunningham. I want shareholders to be engaged in corporate governance. It's part of our democratic process. However, SEC Rule 14A8 sets a very low bar for shareholders to submit proposals for inclusion in a company's proxy statement. So do you believe that we run the risk of rogue actors like the CCP could game the shareholder proposal process to put our firms at a competitive disadvantage in the global markets? If so, how could we prevent this from happening?
Yes, I think there's a great risk when the SEC relaxes all of its filters and permits any proposal to be submitted, especially the social proposals, where the judgment of the SEC staff alone will determine whether a proposal needs to be submitted or not, and without any nexus to the corporation or its shareholders. And that is, the risks are endless, of the sort you referred to about competitive disadvantages and just misallocation of corporate resources. So I think restoring that constraint should be a high priority.
Great. Well, thank you so much. With that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.